The National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship advocates for quality cancer care for everyone touched by cancer. Founded by and for cancer survivors, NCCS defines someone as a cancer survivor from the time of diagnosis and represents the millions of Americans who share a common experience, living with, through, and beyond a cancer diagnosis. In Cancer Convos, NCCS talks with survivors, advocates, caregivers, providers, and health policy experts about survivorship, advocacy, and public policy. For more information about NCCS, visit our website at canceradvocacy.org.
Hello, I'm Shelley, Fuld, Nasso, CEO of the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship. I'm excited to welcome 3 guests today to talk about the National Cancer Institute's new study, NCI COVID-19 in Cancer Patients Study, or NCAPS. NCAPS is a natural history study of COVID-19 in people with cancer. My guests today are Dr. Larissa Corday, Andrea Denikoff, and Patty Spears. Dr. Corday is the study protocol chair for NCAPS and head of breast cancer and melanoma therapeutics in the clinical investigations branch of the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program at the NCI. Andrea is a nurse consultant in the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program, or CTEP, at the NCI. She serves as head of clinical trial operations for the NCI's National Clinical Trials Network and the scientific liaison for patient-reported outcomes. And Patty is a research advocate member of the NCAPS working group, as well as chair of the patient advocate committee at the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology. Last month, Patty received the 2020 AACR Distinguished Public Service Award in recognition of her longstanding advocacy for cancer patients and their loved ones and caregivers. So first, I'm going to start with Dr. Corday. Can you give us an overview of the NCAPS study and help me understand what a natural history study is and how it differs from treatment-focused clinical trials?
Yes, Shelley, thank you so much for having us and for putting together this important podcast on this topic. We decided that we wanted to launch this study because we know that patients with cancer have potentially a higher risk of severe complications from COVID-19. Risk factors for cancer themselves are sometimes also risk factors for COVID-19. So patients with cancer may be older, have more underlying health conditions, and also may have a decreased immunity because of both the underlying cancer and because of the treatments that they receive. Also, cancer patients who are undergoing active treatment by necessity will need to come into the clinic and therefore have potentially higher risk of exposure. We know from data from early studies done in China and then additional studies done here in the US that when cancer patients develop COVID-19, they seem to be at higher risk for more severe outcomes like requiring admission to the hospital or to the ICU. And some early data from initial reports here in the US and in Europe suggest that cancer patients may have a higher mortality from COVID-19. So we launched this longitudinal natural history study in order to be able to truly understand the effects of COVID-19 on cancer patients, both in terms of how they do in the short term if they develop COVID-19, but then also how they do in the long term. So how the COVID-19 might affect their cancer treatments in the future and how having had COVID might affect their long-term cancer outcomes. And we hope this long-term natural history study will help to guide future care for cancer patients who develop COVID-19. You had asked about what exactly is a longitudinal natural history study. And basically what that means is that we're not prescribing particular treatments. We're not testing specific types of drugs or therapies for these patients, but rather just seeing how they're treated and then how that affects them long term. So that's really what a natural history study is. It's just kind of trying to better understand how this illness affects cancer patients specifically.
Great, thank you. So I read on the NCI website, Dr. Dorshow wrote that you all took this study from idea to launch in 6 weeks. That's pretty incredible. So how long would planning a study like this usually take, and how were you able to pull it off in 6 weeks?
Yes, we launched this study incredibly quickly. We thought it was really important to be able to have something up and running so that we could very quickly answer questions about COVID-19 and cancer. I think right now we sort of see daily new information coming out about COVID-19, and we really wanted to be able to provide as much information as possible for our cancer patients about how this disease might affect them, how this illness would affect them. Normally, to launch either a clinical trial or even an epidemiologic study, another natural history study, the normal process could take months or even years. But we were able to respond very quickly here for a number of reasons. First, the NCI leadership really made that a goal and said, please get this up and running as quickly as possible because it's so important. We convened a working group of experts and had calls, multiple times a week. And the people involved in the study, all the experts, both within NCI and in the extramural community, really just gave incredibly generously of their time and their expertise, put other things on hold to be able to devote time and energy to this effort. And because of that, we were really able to get this up and running in record time. We, went from an idea to the actual study activation in a very short period of time, in 6 weeks, as Dr. Dorschau said. And our sites have actually also responded similarly to the urgency of this question. Since the study launched on May 21st, we've had more than 600 sites activate the study, and we're just starting to see enrollments to the trial. So we're very, very excited both about being able to collect this information, but also just as importantly about the incredible response that we've had in trying to get this access to this information so that our patients can learn more about how this disease might affect them.
Well, I just want to thank you for doing this survey, this study, because I think it's so important to cancer patients to understand, there's just so many questions and unknowns. And, the cancer patients that we hear from are, they know they're at higher risk, but they don't really know what does that mean exactly. And our last podcast episode was with 3 people living with metastatic cancer and talking about the challenges of living with metastatic cancer in a pandemic. And they also reflected what they were hearing from their communities. And there were some patients who, feel like they need to just hole up in their homes and not do anything because they're trying to protect their health. And others, particularly people who maybe have not as great of a prognosis, who feel like if their lifespan is already limited, they don't want to spend it holed up at home and they want to be with their family and making memories. So having more data to really guide people in their decision making is going to be incredibly important. But I'm wondering, because we know that so many cancer patients are going to great lengths to avoid infection because of their risk, but then again, of course, some people don't have jobs that allow them to work from home or don't live with people in their family who go out and work in the world and potentially could bring home infection. So I know you're looking for 2,000 people with cancer who also have COVID-19. Are there any estimates of how many cancer patients have COVID-19?
So that's a great question, Shelley. And I think that the short answer to your question, truthfully, is no. We don't know. And it's an important question. I think, as you said, cancer patients are very much balancing sort of these competing risks or competing problems. So if you completely stay at home to avoid exposure to COVID-19, you may risk, if you're on active therapy, that there are repercussions in terms of your cancer treatment if you don't go into the clinic to get your treatment. And so trying to find that balance between risk and taking care of your own personal health is, I think, crucial. And any information that we can provide for patients about this to help them make those decisions is really where we want to go with this. Patty, I wonder if you wanted to chime in on this question. I think that this is a key and crucial issue that patients are facing all over the country in trying to make these decisions.
Right. That's something that I think every cancer patient thinks about. And you have cancer patients who are beyond their treatment, but they still have the underlying conditions. And so they're really hunkering down, and they always have the what if type of thing. is it going to be worse if I get COVID after having cancer? But there's also, I think, the more immediate need, and what this study addresses is those cancer patients that are undergoing treatment right now, and they really don't have the option, or they don't feel like they have the option of treatment versus exposure. And, what if I get COVID? So I think this is a really important study for patients because, there's a lot of anxiety out there, and there's a lot of, what if I do get COVID? So looking at, does having COVID have an effect on the current treatment that you're undergoing, as well as those long-term outcomes that Larissa mentioned are really important. What do we need to monitor more closely in the long term for patients that were diagnosed with COVID-19? And then also, if having cancer itself affects the COVID outcome, because we know it's such a serious disease, and does having cancer really affect the course of your COVID? So I think this study is really important for patients in answering some of those questions to alleviate some of that anxiety.
Does the study include people who've completed active treatment or just people who are currently in treatment?
So we really did want to focus on the patient population that would be expected to have immune effects from either their underlying cancer or from their current cancer therapy. So for patients, so we really are focusing on the active treatment population, those that are currently undergoing some type of active therapy. Now that's very broad. That could be chemotherapy, immune therapy, the monoclonal antibody treatments. For metastatic cancers, even endocrine therapy, like for prostate or breast cancer, patients who are undergoing radiation treatment, and targeted therapy treatments. So things like lung cancer and breast cancer have some targeted therapies. And so we are broad about types of treatment, but we are seeking to enroll patients on active treatment. And the reason we made that distinction is that, this again is our opportunity to gain information on a very unique subset of people who might develop COVID. And so we wanted to be able to give as definitive as possible information to those who are really undergoing treatments that we expect would somehow interact with COVID, either make them susceptible to more severe illness, or, might cause sort of, as Patty was saying, these downstream effects that if you have COVID and you're on active therapy, does having had COVID and the comorbidities that might develop from that subsequently affect what we can do in terms of treating the cancer? So these are the key questions that we're trying to answer with this study. I'll just add that, as one designs a study, we all think about, we want to answer all the questions, but each study can only answer a specific set of questions. We can't answer all the questions. And so we did have to sort of pick and choose in terms of what was the most important to get from this study, and to try to identify the data that we're not going to get anywhere else. And so that's sort of how we came to the conclusions that we did in terms of our eligibility criteria.
And that makes a lot of sense. And obviously you can't answer every question with a single study, but I do think that the question of how long-term survivors may fare with COVID is really important as well. I know I was talking to a woman who's a respiratory therapist, and she's a 30-year Hodgkin's survivor and has, severe issues, long-term issues from her treatment 30 years ago, and is really terrified. She said she feels like she's playing Russian roulette every day that she goes into the hospital, because her job involves being around people who've had COVID, and she knows that her immune system is compromised. So I guess, maybe someday we can also do a study that looks at the long-term survivors as well, because I think they have, a lot of concerns and risks, and that data would be very helpful to them.
And I will add that there are other studies. And so I think that there are other data collections and studies that will hopefully address some of the questions, the really important questions that you just raised. There are a number of registry efforts around the country, through ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, through ASH, the American Society of Hematology, through something called CCC19, Cancer and COVID Consortium, been subscribed to by many academic sites across the country. And so I think that some of those efforts will hopefully get at some of the questions that you raised. Our effort, I will add, is including things like biospecimen collection and imaging collection that I think are really, really crucial to helping us understand this disease in the active treatment patients. So again, it's sort of a balance of, what other studies are in progress, and then what can we contribute that's unique.
Great, that's helpful, and I think we can try to include links to those other data collection efforts in the show notes for this episode. So now let's talk a little bit more about what does it look like for someone, what does it look like for someone to participate in this trial? You talked about some of the data collection and biospecimens. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So one important thing is that, we wanted to be sensitive to patients either not wanting to or not being able to travel in order to participate in this study. So that exposure question once again. So participation in this study can be almost completely remote. Consent can be remote. We are collecting clinical information. So some of that is, questions the research coordinator would ask the patient. Some is information that would be already available in the patient's medical record. And then in terms of, we are doing blood collections, but we're focusing on really asking only for blood collections when the patient is physically in the clinic for blood collections for their standard of care. So we're not asking patients to come in specifically to have a blood draw just for research. Andrea, maybe if I've missed anything, you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Well, we launched the study so rapidly, we weren't able to include some pieces so we could get it up and running, but we are planning to add patient-reported outcomes and issues related to quality of life for people on cancer treatment and have COVID. So, and those also can be completed either remotely or when they do come to clinic. So I think those will be important components as well. So our goal was to try to make this as streamlined for sites and for patients so that we were protecting their safety and the sites as well.
So if someone was interested in participating, how would they go about, finding when you said there were 600 sites? Do they need to go through one of those sites, or what's the best way for somebody to get involved?
As you just mentioned, there are over 600 sites already having activated the study across the country, and we are hoping for more. We know that, just as processes for any trial can be clunky, our processes for getting a study up and running, although we were able to get it out to sites quickly, it often still takes some time for the sites to go through all their activation steps. So I think the first step for a cancer patient who's interested in participating, if they have COVID-19, would be to reach out to their own oncologist to see whether within their own clinics that they're normally treated in, the study is available. If it's not, they can go to some of our internet resources to see what sites are open. And so maybe, Andrea, you can talk a little bit about how a patient might find out where the study's available.
Yeah, happy to. The National Cancer Institute website, cancer.gov, has information about the study on the website, and with direct links of every center that has it open with a phone and email contact. But I do think, since this is occurring during a pandemic and the majority of the patients being enrolled in the study are undergoing active cancer treatment, probably the safest thing to do is for them to participate at their center. Certainly, if where they're receiving their cancer treatment is not one of our 600 sites across the country, they certainly could inquire about that there being a site potentially within their region, since we do allow remote consent. But to me, as a nurse who've taken care of many patients over my career, for this particular study, I would think maintaining their cancer therapy and their safety during this pandemic would be to enroll via for those patients who are at one of these centers. And that's why we're really trying to promote this study to as many of our sites and encourage them to activate it so that patients do have an opportunity to have this at a place where they're receiving their cancer therapy. So we are trying to promote it widely. both to sites and even Patty might comment, having patient advocates involved in advocating to sites that are involved in our network to please open it.
I think if you are at a site that doesn't have it open, you can definitely inquire with your oncologist and see if there's a way for them to get it open. I agree with Andrea totally that, the whole premise of this study is safety for the patient and everyone else, and lessening the burden to the patient as far as participating in this study. So it would be really good to participate at your own site if you can. That's the best way. Also, I think this might be a good place to mention that there's two ways to enter the study. Either you have a positive COVID-19 test within the allotted time period, or you're awaiting a COVID test. So if you've been, had your sample taken and you're awaiting the results of a COVID-19 test and are in active cancer treatment, you can pre-enroll in step 0 of the study. And then if it's positive, you can enroll in the study. And if it's negative, then you don't enroll in the study. So it's a way of patients getting access to it earlier in the process.
I know you're following people for 2 years and collecting data over the 2 years. How quickly, though, will we have any kind of results? I mean, I know that, time is of the essence with this pandemic. And so will there be sort of interim reporting on what you're learning from the people enrolled in the trial?
Absolutely. And I think that's a crucial question because, if we waited until we accrued 2,000 patients and then followed them all for 2 years, then essentially we'd be getting data on this out 5 years from now. And that probably is not going to be very helpful in guiding their initial care. So I think there's two different aspects of this. One is sort of that very short term, how does this affect patients in the short term? And we are planning to turn around data for those types of questions as quickly as possible. A lot of this will depend on how many patients we accrue to the study and how quickly, but we are planning that for the first, 100 or few hundred patients, we will be reporting initial data and also doing some of the biospecimen work as quickly as we can. And so we would hope to get information out to the public from those initial analyses, potentially sometime in the early part of 2021. And we hope that would help to guide the acute care of cancer patients who develop COVID-19. And then for the long-term data, I think that a lot of that is going to really help us to know, if patients do develop comorbidities from COVID, how do we best manage those and balance the management of those in cancer patients? And so some of that data really affects long-term care for cancer patients. And so again, we hope to be able to get some data out as quickly as possible, basically not so much in real time, sort of as it's coming in one patient by one patient, but as we get blocks of patients, sort of the first 100, the first 500, and we can get the first, 3 time points, 5 time points, we are planning on trying to get information out as quickly as possible.
We know that COVID-19 has a disproportionate impact on African Americans and other people of color. What efforts are you making to ensure representation in the trial of different groups of patients?
Yeah, so again, I think that's incredibly important. And I think, we're still very much trying to understand the sort of racial and ethnic disparities in terms of how severe COVID occurs or in who is at highest risk for severe COVID infection. And that's true in the subset of patients with cancer who will develop COVID. Within our clinical trials networks, we have sites that are highly representative of minority and underserved populations, and we plan to enroll at those sites. We will also be very carefully monitoring our data from that standpoint to ensure that we have adequate representation of minority and underserved populations. And I think if, as I said, we're going to be sort of looking after the first 100 and 500, if we're finding that we're not seeing that representation that we know we would expect in terms of severe COVID infections, then we would reach out to those sites that have the ability to accrue those patients because they're seeing more patients in underserved communities and ensure that they've activated the study and that they're enrolling patients. So, Andrea, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. We care very much about having our population in this study represent those who have COVID and cancer. And so we're going to be watching accrual closely. And we've worked closely with our colleagues that run the NCI's Community Oncology Research Program that has a special community-based program focused on sites that have minorities and underserved and rural patients as well, and are doing extra efforts to make sure those sites activate the study and we enroll patients all over the country, but also including those disproportionately impacted by COVID, which does appear to be minority communities. So as the study is enrolling, we'll continue to look at our accrual, and NCI's Office of Communication and Public Liaisons has a special partnership relationships with some minority outreach and social media and other venues to reach communities around the country. And again, working with those sites, try to increase awareness of this study, both at the sites and their surrounding communities. So it is something we really want to pay attention to and monitor and make sure we do as much outreach as we can.
And one thing I'll add to that is that we do have a broad range of the study materials translated into Spanish. So we have Spanish consent forms. We will have the quality of life, many of the quality of life instruments and patient-reported outcome instruments in Spanish. And I believe that NCI's cancer.gov also has a Spanish translation, a Spanish version of the overall study overview.
Yes, they do. They have a Spanish page for it, right?
Great, thank you. And we'd be happy to share that information on our website and social media as well. So I want to ask you, you mentioned remote consent, and I know that, obviously with the pandemic, there's been an explosion of telehealth, and we've been working on a project to bring patient perspectives to telehealth, and we did some focus groups with cancer patients and cancer survivors on how what they've thought of the telehealth that they've accessed and what recommendations they have for making it more effective. And they did talk about remote consenting for clinical trials. So I'd be interested in how that's working, and how do you see this? Do you see this as the future for clinical trial enrollment to reduce barriers for patients by allowing for remote consent? And what are the downsides of remote consent? I asked 3 questions at once.
So I would say, we thought it was incredibly important to include remote consent in this study. And the institutional review board that oversees this study is the NCI Central IRB. And they were similarly also interested in, ensuring basically that this can be done, and that this can be done safely and in a manner that is consistent with with our national regulations regarding human subject protections. So there are processes to do remote consent and to ensure that it's done in a manner that allows the patient to ask all the questions that they have, to make sure that they understand the study and that they really have an opportunity to express any questions or concerns that they might have. And so, do I think that this is the wave of the future? I think that, the underlying issue here is the process of informed consent. It's not a signature on a piece of paper. It's a conversation. It's a study team informing the patient about what they're going to be doing on the trial, what's being asked of them, what the potential benefits are. And then that process continues throughout participation in terms of informing patients of either important results that come out from the trial or, additional information that comes out about the subject. And so that process can be done remotely as long as the, certain regulations are adhered to. And so we are we're very dedicated to making sure that, the patient voice is heard, that patients are able to really understand the process and to consent to participating in a study in a manner that is safe for them and in a manner that allows them to be able to have all the information that they need in order to participate. I don't know, Patty, if you maybe want to add anything to that.
Right. I think this is one of the silver linings, actually, is the remote consenting. And I think it's really a matter of safety, safety for the staff as well as the patient. But I think, even if a patient is hospitalized in ICU, you don't want a lot of people walking in there to consent for a study. So even if a patient is in a hospital, it might be a remote consent per se. So I think that this is really something that's necessary. And I think in the world of virtual appointments and talking to patients in a different way, that way it also opens up the conversation to be had without a mask on. So there might be easier understanding. You can talk about the trial in a virtual format. I found some of the doctors I work with say that's really nice, and then have the signing of the consent in the clinic, and then you don't have to explain the trial mask to mask. You can actually explain it in a much better environment. So it's really about, does the patient understand the study and how you do it? But I think remote consenting, I hope, continues in the future.
Yeah, Patty, I know you're really passionate about informed consent and it being done correctly. And it's not about, signing a piece of paper that people don't understand. It's about the conversation and the education that has to happen. So it seems like there's, a lot of potential for this going forward. And we can sort of prove it now by necessity in this pandemic, but then take the lessons learned from it to make the process better for patients going forward. So, Patty, can you talk about the role of patient advocacy in contributing to clinical studies like this one, and what was your involvement in this study as the patient advocate committee chair?
So we had a couple of patient advocates on this study, and this was very different than a lot of other studies I've been involved in. I think you mentioned it at the beginning of this session that this study opened really quickly. And what that meant was there were meetings 3 times a week, the entire team, and it was a very diverse team, and it was a truly engaged team. And so I think over the course of 2 months, I attended 10 meetings of the full committee during that time. I think they also had working groups that happened, and I was on the quality of life working group and worked with a smaller group of people on the study to come up with that amendment. And also, I think it was really important for us we reviewed the protocol as well as the consent form and provided input on that. That was highly received. And also, Andrea worked on, with the communications group, on a patient brochure, which will be available on the website as well in English and Spanish, I believe. And so I reviewed that as well and added my comments there. And I think, it's really important to have that voice, even if they were talking about blood draws and different things, there's always something that you can add. And I think it was really unique to see the attention to detail about the patient and the burden on the patient to be as minimal as possible. This is a very stressful situation when you're in cancer treatment and diagnosed with COVID. And I think, there was a lot of attention being paid to that, as well as what we talked about in the eligibility criteria. I think this was an area where everybody's a little uncertain about, how many cancer patients actually are diagnosed with COVID while they're going under treatment. Who are those cancer patients? What kind of cancer do they have? And then with the disparities in outcomes in both cancer and COVID, we really felt like the enrollment population should be really diverse. And so there's really some good measures in place to look at the study after 100 and 300 and 500 patients to just kind of take a look and say, are we getting a well-rounded view of cancer patients, and what's the diversity of our cancer patients coming in? And then take some of those steps to mitigate if we want to change the enrollment in any way, then we'll have time to do that early in the study. And I think those were all considerations of the patient advocates during this study.
Well, Patty, thank you for what you do to represent patient perspectives in the design and rollout of studies like this. So for survivors who are new to advocacy and are interested in research advocacy, what's the best way for them to get started?
So I think about this a lot, and because people ask me all the time, and I always say start local. Start with your connections locally. And if you go to meetings and someone's there and you like what they have to say, go talk to them. I was in a meeting where an oncologist spoke, and then afterwards somebody asked me what they should do. And I said, go talk to them. They actually open the door for you to welcome you in. Take advantage of every kind of situation you have. Also, reach out to others as mentors. I had mentors going through this. I'm mentoring new advocates all the time. And I think if you reach out to us longer term advocates, we're very willing to help mentor younger advocates and when opportunities come along, because we really want advocates to be prepared when they volunteer to be in different situations. So I also advocate for learning as much as you can and participating in all of these opportunities. You just had a great conference. There's been recent ASCO and AACR conferences. Participate when you can and learn as much as you can so that you're prepared when these opportunities come forward.
Great, thank you. So before we conclude, I want to ask you, is there anything I didn't ask that I should have asked, or any other points about the NCAPS study that you want to share with our listeners?
So, I think we covered a lot today, and I really thank you for your very highly considered questions and for having this discussion. I just want to reiterate, we're really excited about this study. We are incredibly grateful to all the folks, Patty, Andrea, and all the others on the study team who gave so generously of their time and expertise in order to allow us to get this up and running so quickly. We think this will provide really, really important information for cancer patients who develop COVID. And also for cancer patients who are anxious about COVID. So, we very much hope that this pandemic becomes a non-issue for our cancer patients in the future. That it's not something that they have to worry about a year or 2 years from now. But at the same time, we know that that there can be health repercussions from something like this, and we just want to be able to have as much information as possible to help guide and provide the best care to cancer patients. And we hope that this study will help us do that. So thank you for chatting with us today. And we hope this has been helpful.
And this is Andrea. I just want to echo what Larissa said, especially about Patty's involvement and scientists across the country who literally we sent them an email, and these were in places such as New York, Seattle, in places that were dealing with the pandemic. And because of their expertise, we reached out to them and asked if they would help us in terms of advising us with their expertise. And amazingly, they jumped on calls 3 times a week. The ability for the cancer community to work with the NCI to help launch this was really incredible. And Patty as well, and to really pull this together was just a commitment to how devoted everyone is to helping to understand this better. And I think while there's many, as Larissa had pointed out, there's many registries ongoing, this NCI study that will be able to collect the blood specimens to really help understand if there's genetic determinants that maybe will help us understand why more people get more severe cases than others, and really help us learn a great deal. So I just want to echo that, and really hope what we'll learn will complement what others are doing and really help future patients.
I can add my final thoughts, but they're pretty much echoing everybody else's. But it was an incredible experience actually getting something started so quickly as an advocate who's worked in this area in a long time. It was really incredible to see. But I think it was because of, when NCI reached out to all of these people, from emergency rooms and the infectious disease world and immunology world, they all said yes and came to the table and really offered some really unique perspective that I think really made the study really a lot better. So it was really nice to participate in something this big and this inclusive and that activated this quickly.
Yeah, I just have to add, for example, I heard on NPR, Dr. Nick Marks being interviewed on NPR about what he was seeing in the critical care units in Seattle. And so here he is being interviewed on National Public Radio. He joined our call the next day to give us input. And he had just come off a 12-hour shift and was tired, but he was so devoted. And I just thought, I just heard him yesterday, and now he's on our call today. It was really, and there are other stories like that too, but the devotion and commitment of incredibly busy people with expertise wanting to help.
Great. Well, I like to end all of our podcasts with the question about silver linings that we see in the situation that we find ourselves in. And you've already mentioned, the collaboration of so many different people coming together to make a study like this possible, and the possibility for remote consent. But are there other silver linings that you see from this pandemic, either for you personally, for the cancer care system, for the research enterprise, and just how we take care of people living with cancer?
I mean, I think, not necessarily directly related to this study, but I think that this study is sort of a nice example of some of the things that might be changing in both the oncology care community and the research community. So for one thing, Andrea was just talking about these incredibly devoted folks who agreed to participate in this study. We all did it remotely, right? Many of us have never seen each other face to face. We only know each other by voice and by Zoom, basically. And I think it does speak to our ability to collaborate when it's essential that we do so. And just our ability to kind of put a team together like this across the country remotely is an important piece. And then, to be able to respond to the changing environment of cancer care, right? So I think that cancer care will undergo a transformation as a result of this pandemic that will be long lasting. So right now we're instituting telemedicine out of necessity, but it turns out that perhaps some of our care can be better administered that way. And so, just on a very basic level, having Medicare approved doing telehealth visits for reimbursement means that that is a venue that is now open to patients for being able to have care where it's not essential that they're physically examined by the physician or that they don't have a face-to-face visit. So I think that some of these things that will affect cancer care delivery, probably, in the long term, are things that will come of this pandemic. Now, obviously, we know the downside is that patients will develop severe disease, and there will be repercussions about that. But I think being able to get a study up and running to be able to understand how that happens and understand who's at the most risk will allow us to then, in the future, care for our patients better.
Andrea or Patty, do you want to add any silver linings?
Yes, Patty, I can add. So I've been thinking about this a lot, especially in the clinical trials world and in a world where I think often about barriers to participation in clinical trials. And I think some of the changes that have come about to allow patients to still participate in clinical trials are things that I would like to see move forward. For example, to be have your blood draws at a local clinic rather than going into the big institution. If you have to travel 3 hours to get there, having images taken at your local institution, less visits, as well as one of the interesting things that has come about in this world of oral medications and oral chemotherapy is having those oral meds shipped directly to patients instead of them having to come in monthly to the institution, because we know a lot of patients travel far lengths to get their medications. And so if it can be shipped directly to them like it's been being done during COVID, that would be a big improvement and might reduce some barriers to clinical trials for some of those patients in more rural settings.
Andrea, would you like to add anything?
In terms of the study, the silver lining, I know Patty has a lot of experience in being an advocate, but I do remember several times we would have discussions with the scientists on the call, all these experts, asking about different things. And Patty's calm voice would come on and provide the patient perspective. And I think because there was this, this very much a team effort, I was so impressed that some of the experts would pause and listen and say, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And, I'm not on every discussion in every trial where that always happens. And I do feel like having advocates like Patty provide that patient perspective on a trial that really people want to listen and do the right thing, that makes it, a trial like this safe for patients. And to echo the point of that involving advocates early and often is important. But the other thing we did is, because we were so concerned about the sites, in addition to the patients, is we sent surveys and had phone calls with sites as we were developing the protocol and saying, how can we make this work best for your sites? And we included that in the study as well. And I think that's a key point, that if we can do more of that as well, that's really helpful.
Well, I will just echo your praise of Patty. She's pretty incredible. So I've known Patty for a long time, and I think she's one of a kind. So thank you for all that you do, Patty. And thank you to all of you for joining me today. So finally, can you please tell our listeners how they can find out more about the Ncap study and how they can connect with you on social media?
So in terms of finding out more about the study, it's on clinicaltrials.gov. And as I think Andrea mentioned, there's also a landing page for the study on the NCI's website, which is cancer.gov. The NCI does have, I believe, Instagram and Twitter accounts, which may provide some additional information or at least share some of the resources that are out there. In terms of social media, Patty, I know you're active on social media. I have to say that maybe I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm not quite there yet, but
Yeah. So I'm on social media. So I do a lot of cancer advocacy on Twitter. So I'm Patty Spears, and my Twitter account is @PASpears88. And and you can connect with me that way.
And also, I just want to point out, for people who still like a phone call, NCI has our cancer information service at 1-800-4, the number 4 cancer. And we've been working closely with them, and they are ready and prepared to take direct phone calls from patients. And they also have our cancer.gov website has a live chat. So if you like clicking on live chat on our homepage at cancer.gov, one of our cancer information specialists can also help navigate to find information about the NCAPS study, as well as finding a site near someone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you. We will put these links in the show notes as well. And I am really grateful for your time, and first of all, for you doing this study that's going to provide essential information for cancer patients, and also for your time today to help share some more information about the study with our listeners. And we'll make sure to share as much information as we can, so we can help make sure you get those 2,000 people recruited, so that we can learn more about how COVID impacts cancer patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for more Cancer Convos. For more information about cancer advocacy, policy, and helpful resources for survivors, visit NCCS at canceradvocacy.org. To find resources on COVID-19 and what cancer survivors need to know, go to canceradvocacy.org/COVID resources. You can follow NCCS on Twitter @Cancer Advocacy and on Facebook @Cancer Survivorship.